Hello, good evening. Welcome, everybody. Welcome today. We're going to be discussing Max Weber's political philosophy and ideas. I really got into Weber over the last few days because um, I've been trying to think through more fully what kind of positive vision can we have for a better society? What sorts of social structures should we desire in the future, whilst engaging with the realities of the present situation? And Weber is a very interesting thinker who, it's quite surprising, has had very little discussion within the dissident right. It's particularly surprising because before Mosca, before Burnham, probably contemporaneous with somebody like Robert Michels, Weber was discussing the realities of elite theory, of managerialism, or what he would call bureaucracy. But he was able to integrate these ideas with a broader conception of history, with a dynamic understanding of how culture and politics interact, with a conception of how the religious relates to the political in some quite interesting and maybe counterintuitive ways. In general, he was able to bring an ability to observe reality into contact with political theory, and thus construct something which wasn't reductive. He was a very big thinker on not trying to reduce everything down to one mode of interpretation, acknowledging that no matter how far you get, you can never fully understand the realities that are present before you as a finite creature. Rather, all we can do is paint broad brushes or outlines of the things that we're engaging with. So he's got a bit of depth to him, a bit of richness. And so today, what I wanted to do was go through maybe the broad outlines of his value-free analysis of political structures and sociology, looking at how he sees the different kinds of government or state being structured and functioning, and maybe exploring some of the manifestations of these ideas within our present context, seeing how certain political structures lead to certain ideologies or results being produced. Before we get going, though, let me say hello to everybody who's watching and those in the chat. Valtra, Vingle, good to see you all. Please put your comments and questions in if you would like them to be engaged with. And hopefully, at the end of the stream, I'll have some time to engage with some of those things. So let's get started. And I should say I'm drawing from this book, Max Weber, Essays in Sociology. This is a great compilation of primary sources for Weber, and it includes perhaps one of his most famous essays, Politics as Vocation, which was given to a student society in 1919. Weber had served during the First World War. He had given up his employment and his political standing to do so, and he was outlining the nature of society following the Treaty of Versailles, which he was a great critic of, and he was trying to address this context. And I think it's really interesting because many of the things that we complain about today, he sees in his own context, and this is prior to the rise of the mid-century Germans. This is just on the cusp of the Russian Revolution. So in a way, he's speaking from a moment which predates many of the things we take for granted in our analysis, many of the political forces that we assume to exist. So like the mid-century Germans, our whole worldview, or a lot of our ways of understanding the world, are related to their defeat in World War II. He's writing before that. He's writing at the moment where the conditions for that are coming to be. So I find that a very interesting aspect. So he begins by pointing out that politics is fundamentally concerns the distribution of power. And by that, he means the distribution of the legitimate means of force. Who has the right to use force? Whoever's got power has assumed that right. Now, the state may have other operations, but fundamentally, that is its unique power, its right to legitimate use of force. And he sees that there are essentially three ways in which a state can or a party, an elite group, can justify their right to use force. And this is what Mosca would call the political formula, right? For Mosca, for any regime, they have to persuade the masses, or they have to gain the obedience of the masses. And this they do through having a moral and legal legitimacy or justification for their rule and decisions, which appeals to the sentiments and beliefs of the people. And these are deep-seated religious and cultural beliefs and feelings. So it could be something like the divine right of kings. Or it could be liberty, fraternity, and equality. This idea for the French Revolution, he says, well, okay, we need this instantiated. We are the people to instantiate it. That's why we should rule. Or for in a current context, we might say equality, diversity, and inclusivity. The current regime says we are the people that can bring this into being. These are an ultimate good, therefore we should rule. Our opponents are against these things, so they shouldn't rule. Well, Weber reduces all political formula to three models. The first is tradition. And this is really, we could say, precedent, those long established customs which a people's accepts and thus form the basis for appeal, ultimate appeal. So in a medieval context in England, there's been a king for a long time. There's always been a king, and it is his son who takes over, the eldest son. This is tradition. We accept that. So when he dies, we accept his son becoming the next king. We'll come on to tradition more fully as we go on, but it's not something that Weber spends a lot of time attending to, in part because tradition has become a very minor aspect of a lot of the modern states that he was engaging with. And remember, when he's talking about modern, he means 19th century and early 20th century, though a lot of it will apply to our own time. The second kind of state or legitimization is that of the charismatic leader. Now, the charismatic leader does not appeal to precedent. He's not like a kind of English parliamentarian jurist tradition of saying, well, these were the laws of the past. We've made these legal decisions in the past, so we must follow these precedents now. No. The charismatic leader has a cause, a mission, and this mission has an ultimate value. This could be a religious mission, so one of bringing salvation to the world. It could be a political or humanitarian mission. We want to bring equality. We want to bring material prosperity. We want to just bring order. Whatever it is, it has to be something which has that kind of infinite significance for that individual. And this person who has this mission must bear it within their life. It must be in their very soul, their driving force. They must sincerely adhere to this. He calls this matter of fact. You know it from when you talk to them or witness them espousing this idea. He says that the charismatic leader can take two types. We've already kind of alluded to it. One is the prophet/magician. They have a revelation from God, or they know secret knowledge from the magical realm, and they can bring this, they can use this to improve society. On the other hand, they could be like a warrior king, a true leader who is able to bring glory and victory to their people. And both of these have their origins in primitive societies for Weber. If you think of the primitive tribe, you have a chief, and the chief primarily does not rely on tradition alone. It's not just the son of the previous chief who gets to be chief. Rather, it is that chief who delivers on his promise. His promise is that of protecting the society, seeing it materially flourish, and perhaps even things like conquest. So if he brings his followers booty, spoils of war, so wealth and status, well, then he gets to remain as chief. And the warrior king is an extension of that idea. It's a magnification of the chief. The prophet and magician also has its roots in the primitive society, right? The healer or um, the kind of witch doctor character who says, okay, you're struggling with illness or you have a matter with salvation. I am the one that can deliver you from this. So we have various rituals to pray for rain when the famine hits, or we have various incantations we can do to make you get better. Or if it's a matter of appeasing the gods, here is a sacrifice that you can do. I am the one that can deliver this because I have the revelation to give you. And so the success of the charismatic leader lies both in their person and in their cause. And they are able to attract followers on the basis of their charismatic personality, the sincerity and intensity by which they are able to commit to their mission and then deliver on their mission. Think of someone like Savonarola in early modern Italy. I think he was in Milan. He managed to. He was a cleric who, with great intensity, stood up against the corruption of the papacy, demanded a reform of the lives of the folks in that town, and imposed a very strict regime. This lasted for a while, and there was great support at first, great fervor for his mission. But in the end, many of the people turned against him. It was a rather, he was not delivering on his promises of a better life. They felt it was worse. And he was eventually burned at the stake. He lost the support that he had in the beginning. So you need to maintain that support. This character, to me, reminds me quite strongly of the Carlylean hero. But before we get into Carlyle, because I will compare in a second, let me just read a passage from Weber's essay. This is a later essay, The Sociology of Charismatic Authority, and you'll get a picture of this relationship that I'm describing. Charisma knows only inner determination and inner restraint. The holder of charisma seizes the task that is adequate for him and demands obedience and a following by virtue of his mission. His success determines whether he finds them. His charismatic claim breaks down if his mission is not recognized by those to whom he feels he has been sent. If they recognize him, he is their master, so long as he knows how to maintain recognition through proving himself. But he does not derive his right from their will in the manner of an election. Rather, the reverse holds. It is the duty of those to whom he addresses his mission to recognize him as their charismatically qualified leader. So the basis of any society or formation around a charismatic leader is loyalty to the individual who bears this divine mission. So it's an inherently unstable sort of society. It's an inherently, how would you put it, non-objective, non-rationalized, because it very much is determined by the individual themselves who makes these sorts of decisions. So who should have positions of power? Well, our leader decides that. It's not some abstract principle. It is the one who has the mission. Patronage, status, and wealth thus depend upon the leader and your relationship to that leader. So it's very focused on that one individual who bears the weight of this whole system. To me, it's very like Thomas Carlyle's notion of the great man, the heroic individual, who is absolutely sincere in what he pursues. Now, the truly great man for Carlyle, somebody like Muhammad, Shakespeare, Cromwell, these are individuals who are absolutely sincere in their devotion to the transcendent laws of nature. So these individuals, And it's a very Puritan Calvinist idea that he's inherited in part from his Scottish upbringing, and then also drawing on German Romantic philosophy, which itself is influenced by various forms of Protestantism. This idea that it's not enough just to have a profession of a certain religion, or or kind of identify with your cultural context. Rather, you have to fully embrace that which which you feel in your very being to be true. So for Carlyle, he couldn't sincerely believe in Christianity. He felt and believed that it wasn't rational to do so. But he felt that there was still a divine reality, a transcendent reality, nature or the universe, and that he should thrust his whole being into service of this thing. Such an individual can take many forms, like the poet Shakespeare or Dante, but could also be a ruler or a prophet. So the prophet like Luther or John Knox, the ruler like Oliver Cromwell. And these individuals bring to them loyalty. They evoke admiration within us. We want to follow them. We want to, we're almost compelled to give them obedience because we recognize in them something of that transcendence, that they are sincerely devoted to it. They almost become, we might say, an incarnation of the value that they stand for. And so this for him is the basis of all genuinely vibrant and true hierarchy, that we're willing to submit ourselves and consent to the rule of those who are truly great, these individuals. And in a sense, this is, I think Weber is recognizing this, whether it, I imagine he's read Carlyle, but even if he hasn't, he's recognizing this reality that there are hierarchies based around these charismatic individuals, those who are devoted to their mission. And this seems to be the, how would you put it? This seems to be the real bedrock of natural hierarchies. We just recognize leaders of various kinds in this way. As I said before, it's not based on precedent. It's not based on tradition. So it can be quite a revolutionary figure, the charismatic or heroic individual, because they're overturning insincere social structures. They're challenging that which is not true, which is not devoted to the highest, and saying, no, we need to return, we need to restore, we need to embrace that which is genuine and thus salvific. So it can be a catalyst for revolution or restoration, or however you want to frame it. But it's not just a continuation. So that's why somebody like Carlyle can never be accused of wanting just the status quo or an unchanging order. Actually, it's a continual need to return to the genuinely true, to the sincere devotion to the transcendent, because due to human fallibility, due to, well, various social systems we'll come on to in a second, we're always declining back into insincerity, into what somebody like Praise of Folly or Oros Post, both channels you should check out, would call the simulacrum, the unreal. And I mean, this is in Plato, and I have an idea maybe next week we'll go into a bit of Plato on this. Okay, so that is, so we've done tradition, we've done the charismatic kind of social order, and we'll return to how these integrate more fully later on. But before we can do that, we need to look at the third or type of political formula, and that is that of bureaucracy. And I think from the outset, we should see that for Weber, bureaucracy, though it is the typical mark of the modern nation state. Almost every modern nation state is a bureaucratic form of a polity. There have been bureaucracies in the past. He cites late ancient Egypt, late Roman Empire. He also sees the medieval Catholic Church as a bureaucracy as well. So this isn't something which is necessarily unique to the modern era, but it is something which is widespread or almost universal in the modern world, whereas it was only here or there in the past. For Weber, a bureaucracy is a system of government run by technical experts who manage functions of the state according to rational and abstract rules. Crucially, the defining feature of them is they are separated from the means of administration. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, if we think back to the charismatic leader for a moment, all the functions of government have their ultimate source in the charismatic leader, and all the officials depend upon the charismatic leader's favor for their position and for their wealth and their status. It's up to him to distribute them, and he can withdraw that at any time. By contrast, the bureaucrat doesn't depend on any individual for his status and wage. Rather, they receive a standard wage, a regular form of income, and crucially, they also have no ownership of the actual organization which they are a part of. So typically in a, if we think to like a medieval state, your prince or your feudal lord owns the land and owns the means of administration of that land. They might employ is probably the wrong word. They might have distribute that function to some court official who tallies up the taxes that are incoming and then tallies up the outgoing expenditure. But this individual is dependent upon his place according to the lord who owns the means of administration. By contrast, the bureaucrat, just like most of us don't own the means of production in the modern world, if we work in a factory, we don't own that factory, and we don't own the product of that labor. So the bureaucrat doesn't have any financial control or any power over the system that he is working in. Rather, his job as a kind of independent being, the whole system with a hierarchy of civil servants, is directed towards the pursuing the functions of state according to abstract principles. This emerges for Weber due to the creation of a money economy. Well, he gives multiple reasons. The first is the emergence of a money economy. In the past, your local baron or feudal lord, he would take all kinds of payment from peasants. So it wouldn't just be money, it could be payment in kind. So I will give you so much food every year. I will give you so much coal every year, etc., right? So all of his needs are met through the gifts of the peasants. But when it becomes solely money that the feudal lord receives, he starts then having to work out, okay, I have to purchase various things to keep me going. I'm not just going to receive them. He then needs people who are going to manage that for him, to tally up how much he's making and how much he can spend, and then go about procuring the things that he needs. So we start seeing the introduction of the official who's dependent upon the lord, but who's dealing in these administrative functions. And then this develops with the creation of the state, and more specifically, things like the standing army. Because if the state is supporting a standing army, well, it needs a regular source of income, and thus a administrative body which can ensure that regular income is being established and then being distributed to the military. And the same goes for various other infrastructure, such as roads or rail networks, sewers. So the more functions that the state takes on, the more things that it is responsible for and needs a regular income for, the growth of these officials there's a growing officialdom. In turn, this officialdom becomes more and more diverse and thus requires an independent body in time than from the lord or the feudal individual. Because in each of these areas, say take the military or the economy, well, your average feudal lord has inherited his land through birthright or through force if he's taken it by force, but he's not necessarily going to be an expert in financial matters or in latest military technology or uh, tactics. These things are constantly changing and evolving, maybe due to the introductions of new technologies or new ways of approaching situations. And so he needs people who are going to be technically expert in each of these areas to help him manage them, especially if it's something like a state, like a standing army. So Weber says this is going to develop an official body. And I see Praise of Folly in the chat. He'll already be thinking of Ellul, Jacques Ellul, and his notions of technique as being an explanatory point here. For Ellul, in all life, we all use means to or methods to gain things. This is what we could call technique. We use techniques to achieve things. And in the early, before the modern world, people were quite happy to use means which were good enough. They weren't too worried about it being the very best. As long as it was good enough, that was what was required. And so this is where tradition comes from. My forefather has done this. I have done this. This is the way that we go about achieving this end. But in the modern world, there is an emphasis upon achieving efficiency. That is, using the best technique or method in every area. And so these officials become technical experts and have unique knowledge into these various functions of state and go about trying to achieve efficiency within all of these areas, trying to get the best methods. And so as this system keeps growing, you actually see a proliferation. You might think there would be a reduction in the numbers of officials you need and the number of methods you need. But actually, because there are more and more areas that need engaging with, and each area, to take the army, there's going to be multiple context environments in which you need expert knowledge about the army and different, and thus multiple methods for them. You're going to need more officials to manage each of those techniques. And so by the end, you've grown this great bureaucracy following this abstract principle of efficiency at the cost of all else, in taking over more and more as the need for the very best technique in every area proliferates and grows and grows and grows. So you can see how it's, if we think of somebody like de Juvenel, and how the power center is always trying to take out middle castles, those rival powers, and expand and extend its influence. Bureaucracy is a great weapon for that. So within this bureaucracy, you have a waged rather than dependent body of officials who are all educated. They all receive degrees from various universities and pass special exams. And they are incentivized by the prospect of a regular income, sometimes quite lucrative, especially in the civil service, for example, and of status. There's a hierarchy within the civil service, and you can move up the rungs to have maybe oversight over your own area in time. But we shouldn't just see this bureaucracy as something unique to the state. And this is one of the great insights of Weber, which is shared by somebody like James Burnham, much later, which is that we also see corporations taking on this too. Whereas in the past, the corporation under the entrepreneur, the ownership of one individual, maybe doesn't suffer from this so much. But when it becomes public, when it has shareholders, Well, these shareholders don't have the technical knowledge to run a industry, company within the industrialized context. They need a chief executive, they need administrators who, with their expertise, are able to find the most efficient methods for the production of profit. And so the corporation becomes a bureaucratic enterprise run by officials who themselves do not own the company. That's the key point here. They don't own it, but with their knowledge are able to administer it. The same is also true for Weber in regards to the political party. And this is a product of the extension of the franchise in his view. In the early modern period in particular, with the rise of parliamentary democracy, the franchise was not extended to all people. It wasn't that anybody could vote. It was only actually the notables within a locality who had much say in parliament and the election of MPs. So think of somebody like your local noble, but then maybe the vicar, the magistrate, lawyers, maybe a physician, people with professional standing and what we might call patriarchal authority within the society. And maybe one day we'll get into the early modern patriarchal relationships. So it was a limited number of people, and the political parties reflected various classes in this regard. So in England, it would be the Tory party was typically the gentry. The Whigs represented more the merchant class. But this was rather a reduced system. It didn't require bureaucrats as such, because you're only requiring a few votes in any constituency to achieve a general election result. With the extension of the franchise, first to all men of a certain age, and then later to women, you enter the age of mass democracy, where a few people are not going to cut it. You need to be able to win over a large proportion of the masses. This is particularly true in somewhere like Germany, which was a proportional representation model, where it's not just you're not just competing for one MP in a constituency. You're actually competing to get the largest vote share within the whole country. So you need technical experts, people who are able to find the best methods for achieving election results, i.e., for influencing the masses. These are people who are going to have connections with the media. And I find it very interesting that Weber spots this already at this point, that actually it's not so much the masses that you need to influence, it's the people who have the ability to influence the masses, i.e., in his day, that would be the newspapers. It might also be various industrial types too. But these are the people you need to target. For that, you need technical expertise. You need a waged people who don't own the party, who don't have control over the party in that regard, but form what Weber calls the machine, the party political machine. In time, these people then become, because they are constantly working, unlike the representatives or the notables, as we spoke about before, they come to dominate the processes of a political party and are able to direct who is chosen as a candidate and who is not. So we can see this in a very clear way with David Cameron's Conservative Party. He was the leader of the Conservative Party at the end of the 2000s into the 2010s in the UK. And one of the things we saw then was that he followed a program of affirmative action amongst his MPs. One of the common left-wing attacks on the Conservatives is that they were too white, they were too rich, etc., right? So he had a policy of promoting people who were from ethnic minorities and women to positions to become candidates for election, Liz Truss was the benefit of one of these policies. She was planted into a constituency that didn't want her. They had a local candidate that they wanted to support, but the central party, the machine, placed her in to that constituency. And interestingly enough, the opposition to her gained the nickname the Turnip Taliban. And I'd encourage you all to look into it if you've got the time. It's a good laugh. But so you can see that the machine overturns the local party. The officials are able to do that. So we have the corporations, we have the state, we have political parties. All of these become a bureaucracy for Weber. And I think one of the things that we should see is that we often think of just like the civil service and the administrators as bureaucrats, but for Weber, the whole political system is a bureaucracy, because the elected representatives, they don't own the means of state. They don't own any aspect of the state. Certainly not in the United Kingdom. It is the king or the monarch who owns much of the income of the state, for example, but this is handed over to Parliament. At the same time, the civil service does not own the means of administration or any of the functions of state. So this is a pure bureaucracy, and we see this in the names of elected officials. They are ministers. They're administering on behalf of somebody else, just like a CEO does for the shareholders. But in their case, it could be for the monarch, it could be on behalf of the people, the sovereign people, etc., etc. Now, within this relationship, though, it is the civil service, the technical experts, who dominate decision making. Now, this could also be the case when the early modern prince has his officials working for him in the military and the economy, because these rulers, like a king who's based on tradition, or these elected bureaucrats, the elected bureaucrats' real skill is getting elected. That's what they are good at. That is their primary quality. They are not necessarily experts in any of the areas of government. The king, who has inherited his right either by conquest or by inheritance, likewise does not have technical expertise in the administration of the state. By contrast, these experts, these bureaucrats, they do. And so they are able to very forcefully, with their superior knowledge and means of communication and so on, control the direction of the state and influence the state. So Weber makes this point. You have a minister in a department who's been elected, but often it's the senior civil servant who's really taking the decisions, because the minister doesn't have the knowledge to take them on, essentially. We've seen this in very sharp relief in the last few years, particularly with things like the response to the COVID pandemic. We suddenly saw on our televisions unelected officials, medical experts, we're told, or people who have expertise in the medical profession, informing the elected officials what they should do. And by and large, elected officials following their advice. So in America, you had Anthony Fauci, the head of the CDC, basically directing much of the policy of the American government. In the UK, you had Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, who are both members of a collegial group called SAGE, which responds to all of these sorts of issues in the country. By and large, although Trump did clash with Fauci quite a lot, by and large, there was the bureaucratic establishment imposed through elected officialdom lockdowns and vaccines across the West and elsewhere. Look at China, for example. And I wanted to, let's see if I can get this up. I wanted to just share a bit of an article that I came across recently. It's by Tara McCormack, and it was published just a month or so ago, less than that. And it's quite interesting. I was quite surprised to see something like this in a non-DR context. And just for the record, Tyra McCormack probably she would abhor most of the things that I would say in the end, because she's definitely on the left of the spectrum, but she recognizes certain political and social realities, and I think that's what we're doing tonight. We're looking at the actual observable realities in front of us. She's talking primarily about the British context, but you could definitely see many of the things she's saying across the West. So, and let me see if I can zoom this in a bit. So I'm just going to read a few paragraphs. The technocratic focus on outside justifications in the individual can be understood in the context of long-term trends in the British state. In particular, this is often understood as a neoliberal shift, a retreat of the state ceding all to the market. However, this is to misunderstand the historical shift from the post-war consensus to the neoliberal or regulatory state. In this shift, the state neither disappears nor shrinks, but its role and relationship with citizens change. Primarily, this is a political project that has at its heart the removal of the demos from policy making. In Britain, in the context of rising unemployment and inflation, and the transferring of manufacturing away from Europe, the 1979 Thatcher government was part of a political shift that attempted to manage what has been called a crisis of overloaded democracy, in which mass demands on the state were seen by political elites to be imperiling stability. The post-war consensus state, which has been premised on the management of limited conflict of interests between social classes, mediated through different political parties, social institutions such as unions and the provision of certain social goods, began to be wound down, and a new relationship between the state and citizens initiated. The British state of the 80s and even more so of the 90s was one in which technocratic and non-political arguments were used to legitimate policy choices. The provision of public services infrastructure was steadily pushed out of the democratic realm, beginning with the Conservative Party's policy called the Private Finance Initiative. This policy was expanded by New Labour, and for the record, New Labour was Tony Blair's version of Labour, which also shifted key areas of policy into the technocratic realm. Most famously, for example, removing the discretion of governments to choose inflation rates and making the central bank independent. Political parties were ostensibly framing themselves as governing for all the people and pursuing best practice. We might think here of efficiency, right? What matters is what works, as the 1997 New Labour manifesto phrased it. The politics of depoliticization does not remove the state, but obfuscates the role of the state in relation to decision making, keeping itself at arm's length from policy via outsourcing or quangos and so on. In addition to framing policy decisions as technical decisions taken by neutral bodies, the arm's length state loses capacity and knowledge. The British Health Service is one key example of a central national service that has been changed from a centrally run system to a highly complicated system of devolved organizations, arm's length bodies, and private providers of services and infrastructure. The accompanying narrowing of public contestation, falling away of class institutions such as unions and the shrinking of political parties into post-representative centre and resultant falling voter turnout also led to performative changes to the constitution. In lieu of representation and contestation, managerial criteria such as transparency and efficiency were promoted. So we can see that there's been a shift in more recent history, at least in Britain, and I would imagine elsewhere, towards a managerial, bureaucratic society. And bureaucracy naturally tends towards technocracy, although not all technocracies are bureaucracies, because bureaucracy is dedicated to finding the best method for any particular task. And technology, industrial technology, obviously helps with that. It provides more efficient means. And so the constant evolution of technology is harnessed by the bureaucratic state to become a technocracy. And so when we look at something like the COVID context, and this is what this article is really pointing out, is that, and it's put here, the response to COVID wasn't an exception. It wasn't just something out of the blue. People talked about the new normal. Actually, it was just the consequence of a long time of bureaucratic and technocratic rule, where seemingly neutral decisions, apolitical decision making, is undertaken by the bureaucracy, who are following these rational principles, objective principles, such as efficiency. We might include things like health. I think that's really grown in the last century. Healthcare, particularly in Britain. The health of the nation, etc., etc. Growth in the economy. These are seen finding the most efficient ways to achieve these things. These are the true kind of masters of much of what's going on. And just on this point on neutrality, this is something that Paul Gottfried really brought firmly into the discourse, in that if something is seen as apolitical, then it provides a means by which people can gain much more power through it. So take something like health. So we've seen in the last number of years a increasing emphasis on appealing to health as a justification for actions, and the realm of health expanding. So it's no longer just physical health and curing you, it's about preventing you getting ill. It also includes contentious things like mental health, and that brings the whole of the inner world under the rubric of bureaucratic control. And because these things are seen as good or non-political, they provide an easy means of appeal. Whereas something like, I don't know, let's say equality, although they've tried to make it one of these non-political things, it is a political issue. And many people find it can manifest in various controversial ways, such as over migration. Healthcare is not something which is up for debate, certainly in the United Kingdom. All that's up for debate is what is the most efficient way to improve healthcare. So these bureaucrats could say, well, this method we're pursuing is for a neutral aim, so you should accept it because it's for your good. This isn't something we should have to debate. And indeed, this is essentially the Blair mantra of we should get away from theory, get to practical problems, because practical problems aren't issues of value. The values are assumed. Rational, objective values are assumed already. We just need to work out what the best way of achieving these are. That's what's really going on here. So Weber kind of cottoned onto this a long time before it was fashionable to do so. And yes, so he talks about how in turn this means that the bureaucratic machine, dominates societies that it is within. These technical experts essentially direct so much of our lives, and to such an extent that we become, and this would be an Uncle Ted point, right? The more they take over, the more we rely on their techniques, the more dependent we become, so much so that if you remove the bureaucratic machine, society would quickly fall into chaos, because we're so dependent upon their methods of sustaining our lives and all of the things within it. He even goes so far to say, Weber, that, and I find this a very interesting point, and maybe well, I'll qualify this in a second, but he says it's a utopia to think that we can live without a bureaucracy in the age of mass population, that it's fanciful. Now, he is speaking from a European context, and I think this is important because in Europe we've had hundreds of years of bureaucracy. Our countries are quite small in comparison to other places, and our lives are so integrated with private and public bureaucracy that it's almost impossible to get off the grid from these institutions. The only place you can actually do it in the UK, I think, is somewhere like Darville Community, which I've done a stream on before. It's a group known as the Bruderhof, and they essentially live without the means of most modern technologies in community where they share everything together. But even they require various permissions from the UK government. Even they require to use the financial system here. And if the UK government decided you can't meet anymore, well, that would be that for them, right? They have no power to sustain themselves outside of the good graces of the bureaucracy. Whereas in somewhere like America, as I understand it, there is much more scope for smaller communities to be, and individuals to really get off the grid and live largely independently of these large bureaucracies. Though, as we're seeing, federal powers are rapidly increasing, so that might become less of a possibility. But I do think that has to be borne in mind when we're looking at what Weber's saying here from a European context. If we remove the bureaucracy, there is no real way that the majority of people are going to live beyond a few months, if that. Whereas in America, you already have certain social structures or communities that could survive without a bureaucracy. So, and this is also related to various things like the natural resources and space that we have. So, that's an interesting point for thinking about the future. He also makes the point that the bureaucracy in our context is a product of mass democracy in a way. This is another cause of it or justification for it. Because in his view, the democratic mindset is that of equality, that everybody should have a vote and everybody should have a say in the running of government. We shouldn't allow partisan, personal decisions to get in the way of opportunity, of religion, class, race, etc., should be displaced by rational, abstract principles. This is very Enlightenment, right? These things should govern how society is run, and thus there is a fairness and equality. There shouldn't be special interests. And bureaucracy essentially levels in two ways. One is that there is no barrier to entry on the basis of what we would call primary characteristics today. There is no special interest group who has a right to this. It's not the wealthy, it's not the poor, it's not anybody of any particular race. All that is required is a certain level of education and then gaining technical expertise in a particular area. So that's one area, that it's a leveling force, it's meritocratic, right? But second, it then treats all of the masses, everybody who's governed by the bureaucracy, as the same. It doesn't favor one interest group over another. It follows these abstract principles and administers the functions according to them. So then we see that this process is this meritocratic process becomes a leveling and equalizing force within society. And incidentally, though in Weber's time it wouldn't be associated with something like equality, diversity, and inclusivity, right? That hadn't come into being at that point. We can see how bureaucracy is ontologically um, it is ontologically compatible and a sponge for something like that, because it wants to deliver uh, equal opportunity in its very being. And these are things which are quantifiable insofar as it's how many people do you have in this industry? Can we get representation up in this? What percentage of people from ethnic minorities should we be seeking to target? What about gender and sexuality, etc., etc.? So there's this. This is why I think, in part, we see the bureaucratic machine today so heavily pushing um, equality, diversity, and inclusivity, is it's in its very makeup to pursue leveling policies, abstract, objective policies, which this lends itself to. However, this then comes into tension. It too comes into tension with the democratic will, because it because it's a meritocracy. It automatically creates a new caste to rule the meritorious. And so then this becomes another dynamic of requiring leveling, a constant leveling process. So we see this with equality, diversity, inclusivity too. The HR departments are constantly ensuring that the bureaucracy is also undergoing its own leveling process, that it too is providing equal opportunity for all those who could be in it. Um, and this is reflected in the fact that social justice, at its strongest claim, is that if we're genuinely a liberal democracy with equal opportunity, then we should be seeing across ethnicity similar rates of people getting into industries and bureaucracy. That there should be a largely equal proportion of people getting through these processes, and there's not. And so we need to kind of remedy that by affirmative action policies in various disciplines. That's the strongest form of it, and that would be an objective kind of policy that the bureaucracy can pursue and deliver on. It's kind of holding society to its own internal logic. But there is that tension, and often when you see populists attacking an elite cabal, like we saw Tulsi Gabbard do today, an elite cabal running the country, running the Democratic Party, it's this dynamic of, well, these technical experts have authority over us, and we can't hold them to account for what they are doing. So it's this kind of critiques a democratic critique fundamentally, giving more power to the people, um, which is something to pause and think about, because is the issue that we have rulers like these bureaucrats, or is the issue that we have rulers who are being led by the wrong values, who are implementing bad policies? Because we're always going to have some level of ruler, and we shall see how for Weber the bureaucratic and the charismatic can form a synthesis, a conjunction in a few moments. The other thing to say just before we move onto that point is that the bureaucratic necessarily is linked in to the capitalist system too. This leveling aspect of bureaucracy is useful to capitalism because the bureaucracy has no time or place for special interests such as local tradition or time and space. Essentially, it wants to implement abstract universal policies and remove barriers to the implementation of these because they get in the way of efficiency. So if you've had a butcher shop in your area for hundreds of years, like there is in my town, oh well, we're going to put the big supermarket there because it's much more efficient for administering food and growing the economy than your local butcher's is. well, that's obviously good for the. So we're going to green light that. The bureaucracy, the local government's going to green light that, and the capitalists who own this industry, they're going to be quite satisfied with this because you've torn down a possible barrier, i.e., tradition, local loyalty, and your butcher's shop quickly closes down because it can't compete with the more efficient, the lower prices, the more abundant butchery within the great supermarket. And this might sound like I'm overstating the case, but certainly where I live, we're seeing more. We've seen in recent years, a new retail park developing on the outside of town, with large chain stores being built there, and the local high street is becoming emptier and emptier. Big shops are moving out, and the little shops that are there are struggling to sustain themselves, especially with what happened over lockdowns and then with inflation. So the bureaucratic machine which approves these projects is a friend to corporation. It's not an enemy. They're on the same team in that regard. At least when it comes to overturning barriers to their mutual enterprises. They do fight over territory, but it's bureaucrat versus bureaucrat essentially. So how did the charismatic and the bureaucratic relate to each other? We might see initially an antagonistic relationship. So you might have this bureaucratic regime, and a charismatic leader comes along with his mission and rallies people to him. This is a ultimately destabilizing force, which is rather than an independent officialdom, which does not own the means of administration or production. You have an individual whose personal decisions and has influences and controls these functions. So you could see a revolutionary force there. So somebody like Cromwell essentially comes in, sweeps out the officials of Charles I, sweeps out the ministers of Parliament who remained, and sets in motion his own regime, his own force. But over time, this for Weber, this charisma becomes detached from the individual themselves. People within the regime want to routinize what's been established by the charismatic leader, because if they don't, it will die with the charismatic leader. So to carry on this new epoch, this new sincere form of social life, you need to establish precedents, a new tradition. So we can see this in a way with somebody like Luther and Melanchthon. Luther, the great reformer, kicks off the Reformation in Wittenberg, and it is largely due to his preaching, his propagandizing through the printing press, his personal intensity and emotionality which he brings to the issue of justification by faith alone, that it is his conversion experience extended through a number of years which forms the basis for his standing against the bureaucracy of late medieval Catholicism, which draws so many Wittenbergians to his cause, and eventually establishes the formation of a distinct church, the Lutheran Church. But then the process of confessionalization is really established by somebody like Philip Melanchthon, one of Luther's followers, who gives formal structure to the doctrine. He writes the Augsburg Confession, outlining the articles of faith for the Lutheran Church. Luther never did something like that. He wrote treatises, he wrote impassioned sermons, but he doesn't systematize his thought. Melanchthon does. He provides a much more focused understanding of what Lutheranism is and official bounds of orthodoxy. Whereas Luther, with his emphasis on conscience, has a much broader conception than Melanchthon. So Melanchthon somewhat routinizes, sets in place, transforms that charisma into a tradition that came with Luther. This is the Weberian cycle. And so this tradition in time will become insincere. It will lose its vitality, and there will be new officials who take the running of it, who no longer really have adherence to the vital spark which brought that movement into life. And so a new charismatic leader will arise, and the cycle continues. But in a bureaucratic society, and before I get to that, just to say, I think this is a really important point, because Carlyle's heroes, it's difficult to see how does their absolute sincerity and their ability to gain followers translate into actual change beyond themselves. Weber seems to explain this process as a cyclical model of charisma and then tradition. Charisma setting tradition. We see this with the idea of monarchy, essentially. So you might have a charismatic king who establishes the office. So let's take William the Conqueror, who, by all accounts, he managed to conquer England. He was a powerful individual who had a sense of his right to the throne. Well, following him, there's a number of kings who, the tradition is set, they follow his line. But over time, many of them didn't possess the martial brilliance, the ability to deliver booty to his followers as William did. And so it loses some of its truthfulness in a way, till we reach today, where the King of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Charles III, has very little that's even comparable to somebody like William the Conqueror or Charles I, or whoever you want to draw upon. He's king in name, but he has no ability to follow through on that which ought to make him a leader. And this is I think is one of the things that really strikes me about Carlyle and Weber is that natural hierarchy, it becomes formalized, but then in the process of formalization over time, no longer remains a natural hierarchy. The reason why we make Cromwell the governor of England is because people recognize that he's naturally the right leader because of his charisma, his heroic nature. The reason why William the Conqueror is king is because the Normans amongst them recognize his right to be ruler of England and go and fight for him. But in time, now we've got a king who, by all accounts, is not seen as the natural leader of this country. We see this in the parliamentary politics too, that none of these people strike us as the right people to be natural leaders, but they have the office that is supposed to reflect natural leaders. And so we lose that affection, that bond that should bind us to them. There's still affection in some of these bonds. So when the Queen died in the United Kingdom, many people saw an outpouring of emotion that they didn't expect, loyalty and a longing and love for their country that they didn't expect. But this outward form evokes this because originally it was supposed to point to an inner form of this. It reflected the actual natural hierarchy and internal relationship between subject and monarch. And so it evokes that still. It still appeals to that deep within the British psyche, but the inward is no longer there. It is a simulation. It is a simulacra of what it once was. The real has disappeared. Anyway, that's a tangent for another day, perhaps. But in Democracy, Weber sees the demagogue as the charismatic leader. Now, before you think, oh, demagogue is an inherently evil word, he makes the point that Pericles was the first individual to be called the demagogue. And this is the political leader, typically of their party, who, through rhetorical skill, is able to convince a large proportion of the masses, the mob, that their cause, that their mission demands their vote. And such an individual is able to become the chief minister of their state. And we'll come to how they fit into the bureaucracy in a second. But it's this aspect in parliamentary democracy which is key. It's not just the individual; it's the cause and the individual. You can't separate the two. People often say, "Oh, we should only vote on policy alone. We shouldn't think too much about the individual leaders who are standing, their personalities and such like." But we all know that when it comes to elections, we're not just voting for our local candidate, we're voting for the individual they're standing for. And that individual's integrity, sincerity, the way in which they manifest their policies and the broader vision it's a part of seems to influence a lot of us. So in the United Kingdom, for example, we don't vote for our prime minister. What we do is we vote for the MP, the elected representative of our constituency, an area, essentially. And the party with the most MPs, then their leader gets to become prime minister. But the whole election cycle is not really about your local candidate too much, but rather the leaders of the various parties and which one you would like to see as the leader. So in the last election, it was Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson. This is even more the case with presidential election in the United States, but then also in the House of Representatives and the Senate. You've now got individuals who is, in the Republican Party saying, I'm a MAGA Republican. I am a Trumpian Republican. I'm standing on his ticket, essentially, in his vision, in his cause. So this seems to be a vital part of the election process. And politicians who have a strong mission and a cause seem to do very well at elections. So, for example, Donald Trump, right? His cause was make America great again, drain the swamp. He had the personality to go with it, and he won the election. Whereas, and Boris Johnson would also be another in the UK. He stood on a platform of Brexit, leaving the European Union. That was his mission. And, making the most of Brexit, in contrast to all the other parties. He had the charisma to go with it. And he won the biggest majority in decades in this country. And the charismatic leader, and Weber makes the example of William Gladstone here. The charismatic leader can harness the power of the bureaucracy, because fundamentally bureaucrats, though they have this desire to follow abstract rules, they will follow a leader. If it will help expand their power. So the charismatic leader is able to harness the machine to their own ends. I think of somebody like Tony Blair in this regard. Blair and New Labour were promised a new era for Britain, cool Britannia, as they called it, with practical solutions to many of the issues of the day. They were in strong alignment in giving the bureaucracy much power, creating new bureaucrats. So, for example, creating a new court, the Supreme Court in the United Kingdom, various regulators like Ofcom for the media, Ofgem for the energy sector, making the Bank of England an independent body of Parliament. So he was a charismatic figure who was able to align with the bureaucracy to get through his mission. And in so doing, he was able to harness this power and get them on side, entrench his position. And Weber makes this point: whoever can harness the power of the bureaucracy has the most powerful instrument within the modern Western world. Because whoever has that controls all of the functions of society. However, certain charismatic individuals are not able to do so because they run in direct conflict with the bureaucracy. So think of Trump. Part of his promise was draining the swamp. And so by the swamp, he means the bureaucracy, right? The bureaucracy which runs the United States of America. He set himself up on a collision course with the bureaucracy. And thus, although he became president, although he had the charisma and his mission was appealing to many people, he was unable to do very much because the officials that were in his regime were constantly working against him. You may think that was for good or for ill, but that's the reality. You could also say the same about Jeremy Corbyn in the British Labour Party. Corbyn won a landslide election within his party to become the leader. This happened because under the former leader, they had a new membership model, which made it much easier for new people to join. And so Corbyn got a lot of radical leftists into the party and they voted for him. But the bureaucracy of the Labour Party was Blairite. And they were deeply concerned by Corbyn's socialist approach. His so that would have undermined much of what they had already established in the new Labour governments with the private-public partnerships. They bringing power under the elected ministers more than the bureaucrats. He also had on foreign policy, he was pro-Palestine rather than pro-Israel, and he was also identified as anti-Semitic, or at least that's and he did say various anti-Semitic things. But the point is, the bureaucracy took against him. The Labour Party machine and documents were released proving that various members of the central body actively worked to prevent Jeremy Corbyn from winning the election for Prime Minister, or for Labour for winning the majority. He got pushed out, and before you know it, a new leader, Keir Starmer, who's Blairite, gets into power. And we've seen that in the Conservative Party, the machine, the MPs supported by the party machine, have produced two potential leader candidates who are themselves shades of Blair, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. In part, this is because the bureaucratic machine in the whole UK is Blairite. So you can't win unless you are a Blairite. For we saw with Alexander Johnson, that although he won a massive majority, he was hamstrung again by the bureaucrats, where he took their orders over COVID, but on other things he didn't get very much done. The bureaucracy got in the way. But a charismatic leader who harnesses the bureaucracy, who's in alignment with it in various ways, can do so much, can really get their agenda pushed through. But at what cost? The other point that Weber makes in this regard is, so I've mentioned that democracy tends itself to various forms of charismatic leaders, because those leaders who we believe sincerely are devoted to their mission and And if their mission is seen as a good thing, they're more likely to succeed than a bureaucrat, right? But many politicians just want power for power's sake. They're not interested in power to do something. They just want to be in power. So this creates a tension, right? Because on the one hand, they have to present themselves as having noble aims. On the other hand, they don't have these noble aims. Boris Johnson was a classic example of this. He just wanted power for power's sake. And Weber points out that somebody like Johnson, and we see this in Johnson's reign, has no direction as a consequence. They have no cause, anchoring cause, which shapes their policy. All they're interested in is public support in winning the next election. As a consequence, they're going to have no shape to the actions that they take. They're just going to go off in various directions, trying to maintain their power, maintain their base. And so Johnson would continually U-turn on almost every policy because he was scared of bad publicity. But Weber points out, these regimes typically implode in a very short amount of time. And when they do go down, they go down quickly because they don't have that core. Their insincerity is exposed. And so all of their support dissipates because it's rooted in them and their character in a way that requires them that sincerity. So the truly sincere leader is in a much stronger position if they're aligned with the bureaucracy than most of the hypocrites that we have in power today. So we can see then for Weber that bureaucracy and charismatic leadership are not necessarily always contradictory. And they're never in their pure state usually either. There's usually some level of mixture. But a truly charismatic leader can fit into a bureaucratic regime and harness its power for their own ends. And this is, many of you will know George R.R. Martin, the author of Game of Thrones. He famously complained that in the Lord of the Rings, Aragorn, wins the day with the help of many great heroes against Sauron and becomes king of Gondor. And Martin says, well, I wanted to know what Aragorn's tax policy would be. Now, quite rightly, people are, just think this is a ludicrous comment. He's totally missed the point of something like Lord of the Rings, which at heart is a fairy story about the triumph of miraculous good and grace over the powers of darkness, that evil doesn't have the final word. And it is the dynamic of this narrative and the emotions it can elicit which interested Tolkien. So we shouldn't be expecting a manifesto, a Gondorian manifesto by Aragorn. But from our point of view, be outside of the world of the fairy story for a moment, we want the fairy story to come true. We want Aragorn, the hero, to take charge. But we also need to know reasonably and feasibly how that's possible. Because he will need, in the modern context, in the UK or in Germany or most of Europe, he's going to have to deal with the bureaucracy. He's going to have to navigate the officials, the technical experts. Aragorn himself probably wasn't an expert in economics, I imagine. He didn't have definitely didn't have the experience. He was a ranger in the wild for most of his years prior to becoming king. So we need to understand, how can a charismatic leader integrate and utilize a system like this, like that we have now, if we want to realistically approach this issue. If we have a realistic understanding of how individuals pointed towards the good, the true, and the beautiful can actually change things for the better, for a better society. And this is true even if you cleared out the whole lot of the officials today. You're going to find technical experts popping up in time. Because unless you're going to a sort of, as I mentioned before, Darville in a very small community, or a kind of return to natural living, pre-industrial living, then that is the reality that you have, that the diversification and division of labor requires expertise of various kinds. Weber gives us a model in how the heroic individual or leaders can operate within that to a certain degree. And we shouldn't despair, because while the modern bureaucracy tends towards various aims, this leveling effect, as I mentioned before, for Weber, the bureaucracy isn't unique to the modern world. There was a bureaucracy in ancient Egypt. There was a bureaucracy in the late Roman Empire. These, as I understand it, were not particularly egalitarian. These were not pursuing policies that we see today actively attacking their native populations. And it would be interesting to actually explore the nature of the bureaucracies in these contexts. The late medieval church, the medieval church, was that attacking its people? You could make that argument from a Protestant point of view. But certainly, these are not, let's, for argument's sake, these are not social justice bureaucracies, right? So it is possible, it is historically conceivable, having a bureaucracy based on charismatic and traditional ideals, on ways of being prior to the emphasis upon efficiency, on rational objectivity, which treats all human beings as undifferentiated matter to be moved around and fitted in to a system, directing the parts of society as if they are functions towards a more efficient society, making all the functions more efficient, organizing people as such, till we get to a Brave New World or the culture in Ian Banks's Culture series. So yes, so this is something I want to explore in the future, and this is what initially drew me to Weber, because it seems to me that if we're going to deal with the present realities, we need to think through some of these ideas. And in time, I want to see how this could be integrated with various Platonic and Aristotelian notions of the state, because for these individuals, they, like the bureaucrat, have a hierarchical view of society. They understand that certain people will be assigned to certain tasks, but this is not in the service of efficiency. This is not in the service of rational objectivity, but rather under the direction of the philosopher kings or the citizens towards the good, the true, and the beautiful. And all the parts of the state function in service of these things under the leadership of the philosopher king. Could such beings work within utilizing a bureaucratic regime? I'm not sure, but I want to explore these sorts of ideas in the future. So that's an overview of Weber. There are other aspects, and maybe we'll come to them in the future, such as his view on religion and its relationship to politics. But for now, let's have a look at the chat. I'll do super chats first. So we have one for $10 from Enlightened Despot. Thank you very much. Very kind. Weber identified three forms of authority: bureaucratic, rational and legal, traditional, and personal charismatic. But have you heard of the fourth possibility, the impersonal machine, charismatic? Well, I think we kind of touched on the relationship between a machine and a charismatic uh, system at the end of this stream. But in terms of an impersonal machine charismatic, I'm afraid if you could comment below a little bit more what you mean by that, that would be helpful for kind of exploring the question. But certainly, we live in an impersonal system, and the bureaucratic is very impersonal. I think it, because of its rationalization, it has no place for special interest, which is intrinsically personal. So, special interest, things like family, community, nation, these things which bind us together in natural affection, which cannot be explained purely through abstract principle. So the bureaucratic naturally lends itself to the impersonal machine, and no wonder Weber called it a machine, right? As in the political context, um, and that is largely what we're living under at the moment, with these charismatic figures coming in and out. It's interesting though if you look at Biden. Biden, well, he's he's a charismatic leader in the sense that he does have a mission, or the Democrats have a mission of wokeifying America, um, and bringing liberal democracy around the world. But his whole campaign was based upon, and the current midterms is based upon, a referendum on the true charismatic leader of America, Trump. It's, should we have this guy or not? Do you believe in him and his mission or not? And that seems to be the big like the big um, election winner in his view. So he's an interesting case in that regard, and making it an issue about, do you have loyalty to this individual or not? He's within it. And if you're still around, please do put in a comment below, and I'll get to that. Snoozy Loose, thank you for $5. Very, very generous. Good stream. No need to read my comments if you end up going through the chat comments, as you usually do. Again, enjoying the stream topic. Well, thank you, Sneezy Loos. And if I do I'll be a bit selective when I go through the comments, but I may well read some of them. So don't worry. But thank you. Very kind. So with that, let's go through some of these comments. And if folks still want to send super chats, please do. It does help a lot. I'm trying to get my own income here and be free, have some accountability. And actually, that's the point that I wanted to raise, because I forgot to. Bureaucracy. One of the things that we find today is a lack of accountability in the running of functions of the state, of corporations. We've seen a remarkable transformation in the fact that in the past, if you needed help with something, if you had a complaint or an issue with a product, let's say, you need to get in touch with somebody, just pick up the phone, somebody's on the end. Or you could go into the store and you'd probably get some help. If you needed a social service, there'd be probably somebody that you could get in contact with and get some solution. Today, it's almost impossible to actually get some help. At my local GPs, they screen you whether you merit an appointment now. The receptionist does it, or it will be a machine. So you'll ring up a company to try and sort something out, and it's a recorded machine bot thing, which gives you various options. We've all kind of had this experience. Or it's a bot online in an online chat, which is trying to address your issues and point you to frequently asked questions. When you actually do get through to somebody, they don't seem able to help you. And you go round and round in circles, waiting for replies that never come, trying to get solutions to things which never seem to be resolved. This lack of accountability seems to be a symptom of a system where the people running it have no ownership over the system. No bureaucrat tomorrow, if they try to alter what's going on, would have any real influence to do so, because the rational rules, the rules set by Parliament, the targets, the laws, they are the things which they follow. So they'll just be replaced and a new bureaucrat comes in. But also there's no, and this is the problem that Aristotle saw with Plato's society. Because they don't own the means here, they have no specific interest in taking care of them. This leads to a certain degradation of these services. Whereas if this was somebody that actually owned the service, who was running it, you could bet you would probably get a lot better customer service. And you see that with local stores, right? The owners tend to run them, and you feel welcome there because there's the personal investment in their store doing well and having a good reputation. So that is a massive problem, and I think if we want change, the biggest, or one of the most significant things we could have, is to have a social order which is built around individuals who actually own the means of administration, the services that they're running, and they actually take charge in these organizations. Of course, they can't do every part of it. But if you have people who are financially dependent upon these services running them, that would be a big step forward. And indeed, in prior ages, officials did have stake in these because they were dependent upon the individual, personally dependent upon the individual who had ownership of these services. At the moment, they're not. And so they get away with very inefficient work, ironically, in the name of efficiency. It's just absolutely mad. So I think that would probably make a big difference. Before I go through the rest of the chat, I saw that Enlightened Despot did come back on that. So let me address his comment first. This is a bit sinister, but the machine could mimic charismatic traits to protect itself from the great man. Puts up fakes and then gets the people to treat the machine as hero. See our 2011 article published in the London School of Economics. I will definitely check that out. And thank you so much, Enlightened Despot. That's really great. And I totally agree. We see this. Well, we see this in some of these democratically elected leaders, right? We no longer have true heroes. We have people who pretend to be sincere in their commitments. We also see this through the media. So our heroes, even though they are deformed, false representations of the heroic, well, look at something like Marvel, which is in itself it's tapping into the hero and the intrinsic admiration we have for the hero. But these heroes fight for liberal democracy and American dominance and all this sort of thing, right? Sorry, that was an awful accent. Or Star Wars as well. These fandoms, we find our heroes in these places, and thus, they are then outside of the political contest, and B, if they do have a political message, they point towards the message of the current machine. So I definitely see that. And one of the things that I find most troubling, actually, in a strange sense, is that online sub-communities can also draw towards this. Now, this is because we're so deracinated, we've lost our local communities, we've lost our heroes. But we can start to find our heroes in, YouTube streamers or whatever, individuals who we admire and look up to, who we see as sincere. Now, when we're watching a video like this, and I'm very aware I'm doing one right now, we see a snapshot of a person. We see them as they're presenting a show, and often there's a very high standards across this sphere in that, and they'll talk with passion and intensity about what needs to change, and the how to put it, they seem to be matter of fact about these sorts of issues. We need the heroic, we need sincere devotion to the transcendent. We don't see their entire lives and the parts where they fall and where they fail. And indeed, actually, when you think about it, should somebody like myself, who spends their time talking on YouTube, be the object of any heroic admiration? Probably not. But the current system, this is one of the few places you're going to find some sincerity, at least. So in a way, the system is harnessing dissent and uses it to as a substitute, in a way. At least that's a possible reading. I'm not trying to rag on all of my friends here, because I don't. That's not what I'm trying to say. You should admire sincere people and those who have some insight. It's more just recognizing that the very fact that we're here indicates that we found something wrong with society, and that there is something wrong with society. We should be knights of a round table, rather than necessarily watching YouTube streams. But we'll get there, friends. We will get there. So let's see. Hello again to everybody in the chat. Valtra, Vingel, Ludovicus, good to see you. You've never heard of Weber before? Yeah, he's that's one of the surprising things, actually, is Weber in sociology is one of the fathers of sociology. Many of you will have heard of him from the Protestant work ethic, which he thinks underlies capitalism. But I hope to have shown through this stream that many of the insights we take for granted in elite theory, Weber was already cottoning onto. And I think he actually has a richer concept of the historical cycle of elite theory, or elites, I should say, and how elite theory manifests in various types of regime rather than just one. And particularly interesting to me is how managerialism, i.e. bureaucracy, is not a unique phenomenon to the modern era, which I think somebody like Burnham might be guilty of pushing. So yeah, and he's got so much more to explore as well. Like, if I just look at the contents of this book, which again I'd recommend, Weber Essays in Sociology. I'm not getting paid for that, don't worry. Let's see. So in this book we have politics as vocation, science as vocation. Then he goes into structures of power. Then he has a whole section on religion, and maybe I'll talk on that in the future. So the spirit of capitalism, rejection of the world, aestheticism and mysticism, the abnegation of the world. Then he looks at social structures, capitalism and rural society, national character. And it's not just confined to Europe. He looks at India and China as well. So he's a really well-rounded writer. And so over the next week or so, I'm recording an audio version of his famous lecture, Politics as a Vocation, which this talk is kind of drawn upon, but there's so much more I haven't touched upon in that, which you guys might draw things out that I missed. So if you're interested in finding out more, have a look at that when it comes out, because I think it's going to be a great resource, and hopefully we can get a bit more of Weber into the conversation, not least because he has a good way of putting things, actually. I think he's not quite a Carlyle, but he's as good as you can get from a kind of academic type. Hello, Edmund Travers. Good to see you. Charism as personal virtue or Machiavellian means. Well, we kind of touched on this. So for Weber, the charismatic individual is totally sincere in pursuing their mission, but of course, many of politicians just want power for power's sake. So they will pretend to have a mission and use that personal loyalty they build up to achieve power. But in Weber's view, this is quickly going to get found out in the course of government because they have no actual guiding principle beyond their own uh, preservation in power for directing the course of government. So they're going to lose their followers quickly because they'll see they're not really committed to this cause. You need somebody who's at least committed, and people. So somebody like Academic Agent, who I have a lot of respect for and I've learned a lot from. He would see somebody like Tony Blair as purely Machiavellian, I think. Whereas I think Blair, he does want power. He loves power, but he also wants power to bring about what he sees as the best form of government, the technocratic, bureaucratic form, to improve society. I think he genuinely believes that. And that's why his lust for power is so strong, because he really believes he can bring the world to a better place through his ideas. And actually, that's one area that we've seen a new form that Weber couldn't have countenanced, a new bureaucratic form, the NGO. The Blair Institute spends its time working on policies. These technical experts present to governments policies that they should take on, and the governments generally do, because these people have knowledge about areas that ministers don't. So this becomes a new bureaucratic machine, the NGO, and way of control. But yeah, so it can be Machiavellian, but for Weber, its purest form is in virtue. Snooze you lose would also come down to how desperate the followers of the chieftain in a place regarding charisma levels. Principles versus pragmatism, less of a thorough view. Yes. So you're not going to just follow the chief for this, for salvation. If you're all starving, you need to deal with the realities in front of you. And if a chief is the best of a bad bunch, if his cause isn't great, and his deliverance isn't great, but he's better than the next guy, you're probably going to accept him. These types that Weber's illustrating are the pure types. They're not. They're hardly ever manifested in history in their purest forms. Perhaps Carlyle's heroes, the great men, are some of these breaking out moments. It should also be said that we've been talking at like a state level and politics, but at lower levels, we'll see these dynamics play out. You'll get local charismatic leaders and local bureaucracies and local traditions. And this could even extend to like a local society, like your chess club or the dissident right or whatever. These things are going on here too. And so look out for these factors, the charismatic leaders, the bureaucrats, and the traditions that are forming around charismatic leaders, and how new charismatic leaders arise and try to overturn some of these traditions to get back to a sincerity. You will see these over the coming weeks, I'm sure. Hello, Byron Brand Stepwise. Good to see you. Thank you again for your lovely comment last time on about Godfather. You are always my friend, my friend. Praise of Folly, good to see you. Everybody should be checking out his channel. He's been doing some really great work of late. And yeah, he's one of these sincere guys that you should be listening to. He says, even Carlyle calls it simulacra. Carlyle. Luther and his Protestantism is not responsible for wars. The false simulacra that forced him to protest, they are responsible. Indeed. Yes. The insincere has to be challenged by the sincere. RCW, I have no idea what this is in reference to, but I'm glad you've got a comfy chair. Enlightened Despot. Unending technical refinement and rationalization, encaging man in an iron cage of his own creation, leading to disenchantment. And indeed, I believe that Weber used the term iron cage in reference to bureaucracy. Even for somebody like St. Francis of Assisi would be placed in an iron cage by bureaucracy. Snooze you lose. Bureaucracy has a need in the growth of state, meeting demands through expansion, whether military and economic. Runaway bureaucracy, when the state becomes a separate entity or state within a state. Think of Toynbee's rise and fall. Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it. You're always going to have some kind of officialdom in large groups. But whether it become, I think though I would say though that I think bureaucracy naturally tends towards expansion unless it's curbed by charismatic leadership or directed by charismatic leadership, because efficiency is important, right? We don't want to have grossly inefficient systems if we can avoid it, but it's one value among many. This is one of the points Ellul makes. And somebody like the philosopher kings of Plato or Aristotelian citizens who are trained in virtue, these individuals understand the good, are devoted to the good, sincerely and absolutely. And so they're able to measure and weigh with wisdom competing interests, competing values. And so could see, okay, in this context, we do need some efficiency. But there are these other things, such as our tradition, our well-being, our devotion to the good, which maybe take precedent in others. So, so it's a constant battle with the very nature of bureaucracy. But I don't see why it can't. Well, I do see why it's difficult, because these people have technical expertise. But somebody who's devoted to the good, that is the ultimate value. We could translate this into whoever's devoted to God or to Christ would also have that. However you want to frame that relationship, they understand the value issue more than the bureaucrat. Let's keep going. Yes, that's totally right. The only escape from the bureaucratic form of authority is the charismatic leader. And this is precisely because whereas a bureaucracy is impersonal, the individuals have no loyalty to a person, when we have the natural affection for the leader, our loyalty gets placed onto them. It's removed from the machine to an individual. And so it can carry us out of these cages. It ruptures them and establishes a totally new system. Now, is this possible? That is the question in our current context. Because when we've seen revolutionary figures in the past, in modern nation states, they tend to maintain forms of bureaucracy or officialdom. So it's the relationship between these which it would be the thing to question. Yeah, and snooze you lose. That's right. Rebellions and insurrections require someone with power and charisma to align the various factions that form out of discontent. Yes, and one of the things I've spoken about before on the channel is we often think of ideology as something we have commitment to in an abstract way, but that's kind of bureaucratic thinking, really. That actually, I think as human beings, we have loyalty to people and ideas, or who are the bearers of ideas, I should say. So it's not and this is why our naming conventions are like Platonism or Aristotelianism or Lutheranism. We don't tend to say something like I am as a philosophical position, I am a believer in the metaphysical forms. I say I am a Platonist. There's a degree of loyalty to Plato in virtue of the fact that he is the one carrying these ideas, and he is the one who produced these ideas. And we see this in social relationships too, that there's a certain identity that the possession of ideas and loyalty to the leader have for any of us. So when it comes to revolutions, it's marked, isn't it? That there always seems to be some kind of figurehead and leader who is the bearer of these revolutionary ideas, whether it's the French Revolution or the communist revolutions in Russia and China, etc., etc. Even the English Revolution, which, well, let's say the English Civil War. People talk about Cromwell. Cromwell was not actually the key figure in the English Civil War that he's made out to be. Only later he becomes that. He becomes the figurehead for what the Civil War stood for after it's been won. He kind of carries the parliamentary ideology with him and constitutional government in various ways. Anyway, I should get a move on because I'm aware that time's pressing on. Let's see. Yes, and this is a point I made towards the beginning of the stream, and I think Weber was probably influenced by Carlyle on this point. But that's part of the genius of Weber. He's able to synthesize Carlyle and bring Carlyle into conversation with something like the bureaucratic state. Whereas I don't think Carlyle's really got a conception of how that could, beyond an antagonistic relationship, he can't see some of the nuances. But that Carlyle's important for that reason in many ways. Can you lobby a bureaucrat? Certainly a corrupt one. And Weber thought if you can lobby a bureaucrat, that's the end of the bureaucratic regime, essentially. It relies on the integrity of the bureaucracy to follow these rational principles without being partial to special interests. If you lose that, you lose the thrust of the bureaucracy. But he felt that in general, they're resistant to this because they have a stable income and there is possibility of ascending the hierarchy within the regime. So there's an inbuilt reason not to be swayed. But of course, they're all human beings at the end of the day. So that might be a weakness in Weber's point of view. But generally, it's politicians, and Snoozy Lees makes this point, it's politicians who are the elected bureaucrats who are more open to sway because they need support to get elected. And Weber makes this point too. Because they have to bend to the whims of funders and the masses, you can push an elected official much more than a civil servant. Yeah, I can see this. I think that's true. Yeah, like it's the constant reformation that you require. That is the heart of the Reformation. It's the return to what is true, that the simulacrum, that the false, that the insincere has got in the way. Let's see. I'm going to skip a bit forward here towards the end of the comments. Thank you, Wig. Yes. The peak decline is customer service in the 21st century. But it's true. It's true. That's the thing. Or at least you can talk to somebody in your local town in the Middle Ages about what's wrong. You might not get much done, but you can at least talk to somebody. Yes, a little said in a technological society, it becomes very difficult to assign responsibility and blame. Indeed. Especially as, you're just following the technique that's been prescribed to you by somebody else, by a committee probably, that this is your function within society. You don't get to choose it. And you're just pushing it in that direction, right? That you're not responsible for anything in that regard. Oh, the chat is heavy on heroes, my friend. It's just the streamers who are I'm questioning here. Don't worry. uh, uh, let's see. Nominal heritage does not necessarily or even typically involve charismatic leadership. No, you can certainly bureaucrat. Yeah, I think so. This is what Weber's saying, that tradition doesn't require charismatic leadership. It may be it's founded by a charismatic leader, but the normal operation of life is not directed by charisma. It's either tradition, customs, and precedents, or by bureaucracy, administering abstract principles. So this is going to be a constant cycle. You're going to have times of upheaval led by a charismatic individual or figures, and then this will be routinized and set in stone by others, and so the cycle continues. So this constant need for reformation, both in society and in the soul. Oh, I see. Sorry, I didn't. Thank you. I get you now. This is the problem when you go back to the beginning of the stream to the chats and then come back to what you've said later on. So yes. Well, thank you, everybody. I think that's been very interesting. And before I finish, I did see a point that I wanted to refer to. So yes, the family and community at large are abstract. I totally agree. I was meaning just like your family is a special interest, right? Or your community. I should have been clearer on that. But you're right. If you expand it in that way, then it becomes something a bureaucracy can administer. And we see that in Scotland. The current SNP government wants to take charge of childcare and such like, essentially be making the state the family. They had this idea of making bureaucrats responsible for each child, which I don't know about you, but that sounds absolutely terrifying. But yeah, on that really happy note, I think this has been really good. I've enjoyed going through Weber, and from your responses, it seems like you guys have been stimulated by what he has to say. So thank you for your time and attention and for your considered responses. And go away and have a think about it. As I said, over the next week or so, I'm going to finish this rough audio of Weber, and then you'll be able to hear him in his own words and get maybe more of a sense of why he's a great thinker for us. And till next time, I would like to recommend you go and watch Praise of Folly if you don't already, and Aura's Post. They both have had very interesting videos of late, and I think it'd be very worthwhile your time if you're looking for something else to watch. Next week, we may do something on Plato's Cave. We've been talking about simulacrum. Let's go back to one of the earliest discussions of that sort of idea. Alternatively, we may go back to doing story hour. I've not done that for a long time, and it would be good fun to go back to story hour. We will need to see. Oh yes, and of course, subscribe to Vingle, everybody. You mischievous little goblin. But yes. Thank you once again, and till next time. God bless you all. Good night, everybody.